Welcome everyone to the Hawaii Mid-Year Real Estate Review with our favorite economist, Mr. Paul Brewbaker. This is the 11th year I think we have hosted this event, and we're so delighted that you could join us. One of the advantages of doing the Zoom this year, we have nearly 500 attendees here, but more than that, my mom, who is in Palm Beach celebrating her 48th year as a real estate broker, is joining us today as well. So hi, Mom. Talked to her earlier and she told me she closed 2 deals today. So good job, Mom. Nice job. And with a little luck, hopefully we will all be back live at our normal venue at Honolulu or at the Waialae Country Club next year. This event obviously would not be possible without all of the sponsors, and we're really thankful for all their support. And we're going to take a moment just to hear a little bit from each sponsor, starting with Mr. Pete Paffrath. Pete?
Aloha, everybody. My name is Pete Paffrath. I'm an account manager with Title Guarantee right here in Honolulu. TG is Hawaii's oldest Kama'aina title and escrow company. This year we'll be celebrating 125 years of doing business in the islands. Both TG and myself are here to support you. We want to earn your business by going to work for you. What I mean by that is if you need a preliminary title report for a listing presentation, you need marketing support for a new listing, or if you want to have a conversation about how we might be able to potentially grow your client base by utilizing social media, we're always here for you. What I will do is I'll put my contact information in the chat box if anyone wants to reach out to me. I'm available 7 days a week. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'll pass it back to Patrick. Aloha.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks for always sponsoring the events. We really appreciate it. And the next sponsor, Guaranteed Rate, and I think we have Anders Hostelli with us today. Anders?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, this is Patrick. About, I think, 11 years we've been sponsoring this, not as Guaranteed Rate, that was at our previous company, or companies. Love the opportunity. I've known Paul for, almost 25 years now, as we were used to work at the same company as well, I'll say before. But at Guaranteed Rate, we have branches on the neighbor islands. We have 3 on Maui. We actually have 2 on Oahu, and we have 1 we just opened up in Kona. We have over 30 loan officers. We're experts at VA lending. We have lots of new jumbo products. We're here to close the transactions on time or early. We're very focused on purchase business. Appreciate all the referrals, the business you've referred to us. If you haven't worked with us in the past, please give us a try. Really appreciate the opportunity, and thanks for having us. Thank you. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Anders. Thank you very much. And live from the award-winning Master Plan community of Ward Village, from Howard Hughes, we have Bonnie Wiedemeyer. Bonnie?
Thank you for inviting us today. And I think we do a little presentation later, right? Don't I get 4 minutes later, I think?
This is your time right now.
This is it? Oh, I better not talk any longer. Here I go. Okay.
So, Chris, I think Bonnie is going to share her screen.
Okay, so why don't you stop sharing? Go ahead and there you go. Okay, Bonnie.
Can you guys see this?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So I'm going to give you a little quick overview today, everyone. Thank you, Realtors, for your support. It's wonderful that we have 500 people here. I'm sure you're noticing as you're driving through the community that Ko'ula is coming up. The glass is going up right now, and that will be ready in 2022. Li'i closes in October, and Victoria Place is getting close to sold out. So we really want to thank you for a record-breaking year. When we ask buyers, how do they hear about us? It's always Realtors. We do advertise, we love advertising, but really we know it's you who brings the business. And so our next phase here is the Parkour Village. A lot of you have been asking about this, so I thought I'd give a quick 2.5-minute overview today. This is a 600-foot opening right here and 300 feet here. So this is 1 football field and this is 2 football fields. The tower is angled towards the ocean. So it's literally it's a front row like view, but the pricing is similar to Ko'ula. Looks like it's going to be a hot one. We're going to start selling here probably in about a month when we get our public report. And I'll give you a quick little snapshot of what's happening in the neighborhood as well. If you've enjoyed this sidewalk here from Coffee Bean and Tea Leaf to Merriman's, you need to know that that's continuing all the way down the street, all the way down Oahe Street. And I'll show you some images of that too. I think one of the things we're doing here is, in addition to, club amenities and homes, which you find in all towers, we're really selling the park and a town square too, so that you really, you can get in your car, but you can live a more spontaneous life by walking and creating this real walkable neighborhood. Here's the first rendering that I've really been able to see that park. This is going to be something for everyone to enjoy, whether you live here or don't. We can't wait to get this built. Here's Oahe Street. Oahe Street in the future. This is Victoria Place there. Ko'ula is here. And here's the corner of Ward and Oahe. There's the tower itself, real mid-century design. If you haven't had a preview, please let us know. We are paying 4% for the first month of sales because we aren't advertising a whole lot yet. I wanted to say a thing about designing during COVID is that we kind of looked at what things we think will matter to buyers going forward. One of those things is the interiors of your home. We think that people will care more about their kitchens and baths, so we really upgraded the kitchens and baths. The other thing we did was really expand the outdoor space. Our amenity space here is 57% larger outdoors than Anaha. And the third thing is we found a work from home space. So we were thinking about all of this while we were designing. I'm just flipping through these images here so you can see price ranges from the 600s to 2.9. Look at that view. Floor plates. Kitchens are, Sub-Zero, Miele, Studio Becker. Boom, 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 flying by. Don't worry, I'm going to finish on time. And this is something that's really exciting. I think while we were working on designing this, I think I was trying to find a place to work in my house. And so we found a place in about 75% of the units that could be a large storage closet, or you can upgrade and put in this beautiful built-in office with all the electronics hidden. We think it's, whether you work in here or your child is doing their homework in here, or it's just a place to put all your stuff, your office things. We think this is going to be really pivotal in the condominium market. So we're excited. We want to thank you. We've had an amazing experience working digitally and now digitally and in person. And Patrick, I think it's interesting that you have 500 attendees. We have found that we're not having a cyclical market at all. We have had our best months yet because we're seeing people digitally and in person, so people can always look at real estate. So thank you for having us today, and thanks for your support.
Thanks, Bonnie. Thank you very much. And if you can stop your screen sharing, and we're going to go right back here. And Bonnie, I just found out, didn't know it before we started, that today is actually your birthday.
That's right.
So I was thinking about singing happy birthday to you, but I'm going to pass on that, and I think you'll be glad I did. But anyway, big happy birthday, and thank you for all that you do over there and for sponsoring these events. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. That's sweet. Thank you for having me.
All right. And I want to say welcome to all the members of the Hawaii International Real Estate Council that are joining us here today. If you're not a member of the Hawaii International Real Estate Council, we put on events throughout the year that are geared towards foreign buyers and sellers of real estate purchasing in the US and Hawaii. We have 3 great seminars coming up. One is an immigration update with David Garfield. He's a top immigration attorney out of Washington, DC, with offices in Honolulu. We have Jessica Sue, CPA, wonderful speaker, talk about some taxation issues that have come up and some updates. And then in November, we have generally our most popular event, which is Ralph Cosa from Pacific Forum, talking about geopolitics affecting the world and with a special focus on the Asia Pacific region and Hawaii. If you haven't heard Ralph speak before, I highly recommend you check it out. It's a fascinating hour to spend with him. And then my favorite sponsor and host today, Luxury Homes International. Want to welcome all of our agents that are joining us here today and tell you guys it's such a pleasure to work with you every day. I'm so proud of everything that you've done. And through your accomplishments, we are one of the only firms, or one of the very few, that have appeared in all 4 top 25 lists in Pacific Business News. Largest real estate firms, highest residential sales, highest commercial sales, and highest vacant land sales. So great job, everyone. And for those of you on the call, if you know of anyone, we have 3 agent openings in our Honolulu office, both in residential and commercial. And to our colleagues in Asia, we are targeting spring 2022 to reopen our Hong Kong office, and we look forward to seeing you all then. Okay, our speaker today, Mr. Paul Brewbaker. And Paul, I want you to know I spent a lot of time photoshopping this image of you. If you want it for your office or something, you let me know and I'll send it over.
Sis, boom, ba.
You like that? Okay. Oh, they're very good. Very good. Now, if you, many of us know Paul, we've heard him speak many times, but I wanted to point out a couple things where Paul had some uncanny insights, and just to run through a couple quick ones. 2006, when we were at the height of what we now call the subprime bubble, Paul was one of the few sort of issuing caution about being bubblicious and frothy and these different things. And I remember Paul being actually booed at one of the events, one of the realtor events. The question at that time was, how long would this last? And from the realtor's perspective, would it last forever? Well, of course it didn't, and Paul was right. During the ensuing financial crisis that came, the big question was, when will we recover? And I think it was at a Neighbor Island seminar, Paul, more as a joke, gave a specific date. And as it turned out in retrospect, that date was pretty close to the actual turnaround. And in 2019, our very last live event together, Paul was projecting very moderate continued long-term growth, both the economy and in the real estate world. He said there are 2 things that might upset that. One would be a geopolitical event and the other would be a biological. When asked to clarify what would a biological be, he said a virus such as a SARS or MERS. And then 6 months later, obviously our lives are changed forever. Really uncanny, has all the answers. We're so happy to have him back for the hour. He's the founder of TZ Economics, graduate of Stanford University, and has his PhD in economics from the University of Hawaii. Please join me in a warm virtual welcome for Mr. Paul Brewbaker. Take it, Paul.
Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, so I guess you just proved that it's better to be lucky than to be smart. And yes, sis, boom, ba. Name the sound made by an exploding sheep. I'm going to jump right into my slides here, and off we go. Remind me, when are we done anyway? About
we're going to take you all the way to 2:30.
So maybe we can have a bio break at 2, and then wrap up.
Yeah, if that, whatever you need.
Yeah, you know how it is. And a brief one, and then we'll push on through to the Q&A in the last half hour. So this is what Waikiki looked like at the beginning of February. We went, my wife and I went down there for a day, just like, let's go down while there's still nobody there, because I missed it after 9/11. I was so busy at that time that I missed like the 1 week that you could go to Waikiki that nobody was there. And of course now there's this whole, I was in a hearing, virtually on Maui on Monday, and they've got this bill to put in place a moratorium on lodging construction. And I'm like, wait, right at the start of the economic recovery, you're going to shut down. Wait, what? What are we doing? So, I mean, their objective seems to be to keep tourism like this. But we're going to focus more on the macro picture supporting real estate ultimately. And as I described to Patrick and others in our approach to today, I've had an opportunity to do some webinars for realtors recently that's allowed for an accumulation of data that I'll be in a position to share with you as well. But first, I do want to thank the sponsors for making this possible, and happy Kamehameha Day, Bonnie. I didn't know you were royalty. And is that it? Yes, Anders, who wrote the first mortgage I ever got, and because I didn't think I was gonna get one, we didn't actually do the deal. That was 30 years ago, Anders. So yes, we're all older than we think. Here we go. We'll start with the big picture and work our way down. So you really have, and I'm glad this is actually called a real estate review, because most of the time people are asking me for the real estate outlook, and I don't know. How would I know? You guys are realtors, you know more than I do about it. The most recent recession cycle of recession and recovery obviously is a really strange one. I mean, an unprecedented one in the sense that it's been a century since the last pandemic. We live in a different world from the one we lived in a century ago when the last pandemic did occur. Although the features of that pandemic are remarkably resonant with people, mass denialism and super spreader events and the whole thing. The other big difference is that we have a vaccine and they didn't. But a lot of the way things played out, and a lot of the reason why the housing market right now is a little bit kapakahi, is that it comes from the particular character of the recession and therefore the nature of the recovery, and the composition, which moving parts move the most. So I'm going to start with a slide just illustrating the savings rate. And if you've been around as long as I have, you'll remember when all the boomers were getting out of high school in America back in the day, the savings rate in America was probably 15 to 20%, and of course in Asia it's 20 to 30%. And by the time we entered the 21st century, it was like 3% or something, really, really low. And the Chinese were laughing at us. And one of the clearly extraordinary facets of the COVID recession is that huge jump in the personal savings rate. This is savings from disposable income. So this is after-tax income, jumping from about 7% pre-COVID to about 15% in round numbers. And then of course you can see the punctuation of the various federal fiscal stimuli. So if you think about it for a second, right, what's GDP? It's the combination of personal consumption expenditure, which is about 70% of final expenditure, and then investment expenditure or capital formation, right, building buildings, and that's another 20%. And then government, which is another, I don't know, 20%. And by now you're over 100%, but of course we're a net importer, so that that takes us back to 100% more or less. I mean, in round numbers, those are kind of the shares. Consumption is the largest share. Well, if savings goes up, savings is income that you don't use for consumption. So if the savings rate doubles from 7 to 15% or quadruples to 7 to 28% overnight, as it did in March last year, what happens to consumption? It collapses. And so the proximate cause of the recession a year ago was literally a collapse in consumption after you stocked up on Lysol and toilet paper. We all went into your cave to hibernate for a few months and ride out the COVID. And so it was in that moment of reduced consumption that you see this crash and burn in the economy. It's literally precipitated by people individually engaging in the same behavior, which is spending less. Now, the particular character of that reduction in spending was concentrated primarily in services, not in goods. So we kept eating, we just ate at home, we didn't eat out at restaurants. And you, again, clearly see that in the data. Services consumption in the United States fell by $1.5 trillion. Goods consumption really until, except for a momentary drop after we stocked up like we do before hurricanes, went right back to the path it had been on pre-COVID. And when you drill down to the way we ate, consumption of food continued along its merry path, but consumption of food services dramatically declined. And I'm sorry, I'm going to mute because I'm going to cough. And indeed, when this begins another conversation about whether the changes we observe here, for example, with food services, are temporary or permanent. And like in a bunch of other areas, we don't know yet. It remains to be seen. Because of the massive federal fiscal policy intervention, whether you think of it as relief in the kind of the FDR sense from the 1930s, from the Depression, or you think of it as stimulus, as counter-cyclical fiscal stimulus. Either way, people getting checks, businesses getting loans, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, that are actually just grants because they're going to be loans that are forgiven. People getting cash to support them, enhanced unemployment, insurance payouts, people getting cash to help them bridge the chasm created by the drop in consumption associated with their precautionary shift in behavior to protect themselves from a novel coronavirus, led output to decline, but income actually went up. It's one of these weird, I mean, if you do the math, per capita personal income, this is Hawaii personal income, actually went up momentarily. So that's the nature of the bailout. So broad-based was it. And of course, we borrowed from the future, right? Instead of deploying savings into investments of one sort or another, we deferred some of the construction we otherwise would have engaged in. We deferred some of the information technology equipment purchases we might have made had the coronavirus not shown up. We deferred some of those investment expenditures that would have been funded by borrowing, by using others' savings. And the US Treasury, through an act of Congress, mobilized those savings to redeploy that cash across the economy to businesses and households and individuals who were in need. And now we're trying to pick up the pieces and move forward. GDP, as we saw earlier, took a gigantic hit. And now it's important to begin to distinguish between our own regionally idiosyncratic performance, what happened in Hawaii, because of the structure of Hawaii, right? The structure of the economy, the shift in people's behavior, some of which may end up being more permanent than transitory, leads us down certain paths. And then when we start to think about how different regions in the economy, in the US economy performed, we have to recognize that Hawaii was particularly vulnerable because it is a service-oriented economy and services decline. And because among services, not just food services, but travel services, transportation services, tourism services, arts, entertainment, and recreation services, were all of which are part of that tourism complex, were among the hardest hit during the immediate aftermath of the pandemic and the slowest to recover, right? Broadway shows are going to open up beginning this month and maybe a few by the end of the summer. And then we'll see how that rollout goes. But there, that's a whole, the performing arts industry is probably farthest behind of any industry. And that's speaking from the perspective of a state that, aside from Nevada, is more dependent on travel and tourism than any other state in the country. And as you can see, in terms of GDP, got beat down deeper, harder, and has way more ground to recover in the course of the next couple of years as economic expansion is restored. It's also important to remember that Hawaii actually got derailed a little in the mid-2010s. We had a period in the mid-2010s when oil prices fell and commodity prices were falling, but the US dollar was rising in value relative to currencies of regions like Australia or, say, Canada, which are heavily dependent on natural resource commodity production. So when minerals and metals and oil prices, energy commodity prices, agricultural commodity prices fall, those economies suffer. And that dollar appreciation against the Aussie dollar and the Canadian dollar, or for that matter, the Japanese yen and the euro dollar, the euro, as it turned out, made Hawaii a little more expensive a destination for international travel, on which we used to rely for about a quarter of our export revenue, tourism expenditures. And so we did hit a speed bump in Hawaii in the mid-2010s that the US did not have to deal with. And so we were kind of set up like a bowling pin by the time the COVID recession came. Indeed, if you look carefully at the data for 2018, 2019, Hawaii was actually flatlining. As a, you know, the point Patrick was making earlier, it wasn't just that you sort of had to know that that list, geopolitical risk, biological risk, geophysical risk, the risk of a seismic event or a volcanic eruption, both of which we've seen in the last decade, right? The Tohoku seismic event in Northeast Japan in March 11, 2011, and then the eruption of Kilauea volcano's East Rift on May 4th, 2018, and then the nation's heaviest rainfall ever on the island of Kauai in, was it April of 2018? This stuff happens, right? And here's the thing, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions are going to happen with certainty. I hate to say it, but with certainty there is going to be a geopolitical event or a biological event, as if you needed to keep being reminded of it. And so it wasn't that much of a stretch to say, well, here's the list back in the fall of 2019, geopolitical, biological, and geophysical risk, because that's always the list. It's always the list. And so, yeah, you just say that once to a client, and then forever after, if they remember you said it, you'll seem like a genius when it finally happens, because trust me, it's going to happen. Now we've gone through one of these things, and we've got to pick up the pieces. I want to add, just in terms of Neighbor Island performance in particular, but in thinking about GDP for all the counties, it was not a uniformly great decade, the 2010s, that is, pre-COVID. These are GDP figures adjusted for inflation and indexed to the peak of the last cycle, sometime before, sometime at the peak of the subprime bubble. Different dates: 2006 for Maui, 2007 for Kauai and the Big Island. Oahu actually peaked in 2008, the year the recession was unfolding. And if you look carefully at the Big Island data, after 12 years, the economy hadn't, on net, the Big Island economy hadn't grown in real terms. So that's kind of a lost decade. And we're talking about the longest expansion in economic history, which was not even an expansion on the Big Island. They expanded, but they only covered the ground that they had lost in the aftermath of that cycle. Maui and Kauai have had done better prior to the COVID event, but of course, talk about being set up like bowling pins. Maui is the most dependent on tourism, and Kauai is the second most dependent on tourism. So they got a beat down, worse than the 4 other counties in Hawaii, and we'll see some of that in just a second. Switching to growth rates, this is sort of the way the newspapers look at GDP. You can see these massive swings: minus 30% in the second quarter of last year in U.S. real GDP growth, and plus 30% one quarter later. And now we're doing it's the Warner Brothers Roadrunner cartoon sound effect. Yeah, we're doing the oi part. So 4% growth in the fourth quarter, 6.5% growth in the first quarter this year. The various forecasts are calling for 8, 9, 10% growth in the second quarter, and will converge over the next couple of years, according to this is a set of forecasts from the National Association for Business Economics, but there's a bunch of different surveys like this. You can go out and see what the consensus, what the oracles say, and they're looking at 2.5%, which is a little higher than the longer term expectation of something not quite 2%. So yeah, it's going to wobble around. These are really high numbers. 8, 9, or 10% growth is what China used to have and doesn't anymore, and probably won't ever again on a sustained basis. We're going to have that. We're having that right now. That's what's happening in the country right now, which of course is why this morning's headline is all about inflation, because the US can't grow 10% for very long without, the wheels coming off. If you break down, again, thinking in terms of structure and composition, if you break down those US GDP growth rates into the constituents I mentioned earlier: consumption, investment or capital formation, delta K, government expenditure, et cetera. The 2 big swing factors, or 2 or 3, were consumption, as we talked about earlier, And then investment, which there are two pieces. One is the change in the capital stock, which was, negative immediate after COVID, positive, and has remained positive thereafter. And then changes in inventory. So it's a huge inventory reduction at the moment of COVID as we all went out, and bought antiseptic and toilet paper. The toilet paper thing is ridiculous, but it always happens, right? Hurricane, toilet paper. Here we are doing the wobbly thing we were talking about a second ago. We can also break down GDP, and I've done this here for Hawaii, indexed to the pre-COVID moment, to the end of 2019. We can break down GDP. So this is relative to the end of 2019, right? Think of it, it's an index, into industry components. So agriculture had a nice moment a year ago when, food was a little tricky to get. And so the farmers who can actually turn around a crop pretty quickly in Hawaii. I mean, I'm just saying, you guys probably know my dad's a corn guy. So in Hawaii, or at least in Waimanalo, that's 70 days from planting to harvest. So yes, you missed the opportunity to plant for 4th of July, but you still get a crop in for Labor Day. And then you can see the tourism complex, accommodation, transportation, and then the others I've mentioned, food services, and then of course arts, entertainment, and recreation, probably the worst hit by the COVID event, showing up there with declines to less than half, in some cases to, a 2/3 decline in the real production volume in accommodation, food services, arts, entertainment, and recreation. The industry's contracted by 2/3. And if you're an economy like Maui, where 1/3 of value added or GDP is tourism related. And I mean, some of those, tourism went to zero for 6 months. So, well, zero for 6 months, and then something that's, not 100% for another 6 months averages out to what you're looking at there. They're still way behind. They're still, down 40, 50%. So it's going to be a deep, deep hole to climb out of. And the composition of our GDP growth, right? So this is GDP, but this is GDP growth. You can see again that if you break down the change in GDP at an annual rate, the 30% decrease nationwide was a 40% decrease for Hawaii contemporaneously in the second quarter of last year. But then we had the same rebound, almost as vigorous a rebound. And now that we've reopened tourism, we should be on our way back. The forecast in the survey I mentioned earlier, I'm sorry, I take this back. This is the wrong, that is the wrong footnote. And this is the wrong, wait a minute. Did I miss a slide? Okay. I think we looked at a slide earlier, right? So this is the correct slide. This is the Fed, right? I showed you forecasts of private forecasters, including one that's published by the Federal Reserve, this one, Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, called GDP Now, which is one of these nowcasts. So you can go up every Tuesday or something and see what the indicators are saying, like right now, about GDP growth. And what they do is, they scrape these massive databases and throw the metadata into a blender, and out comes a number. These are the forecasts of the Federal Reserve. So if you're concerned about what the Fed is thinking as it goes in to make monetary policy decisions next week, this is what they told us they were thinking at their last, at the time of the last quarterly release of their forecast. Yes, the Fed gives us their forecast, and I think it's the 15th, they will publish again a June update to this forecast, but it's likely to look, the same way. Strong growth in 2021, and then a deceleration to the longer term steady state, which I mentioned is not quite 2%. The consensus in the private sector is that in 2022, it'll still be above that. And the Fed here agrees and thinks that we'll gradually decelerate. But again, the trend is 2% growth or less. I don't usually get a chance to talk about fiscal and monetary policy. You guys gave me enough, the luxury of time to have enough of it to think a little about the composition of these fiscal stimulus packages or relief packages, and then also to dwell for a second on monetary policy and where interest rates are headed. So here's the composition of the original CARES Act in March 2020, and it's revealing to think about the composition, because there's always a political element. This is Congress acting, and we had one administration in place a year ago, and we have a different one in place now. So at the top of the list, there's a rank hierarchy in 3 groups, sort of funds for business, funds for individuals in the middle, and then funds for institutions at the bottom. And you can see that the top items, when the Congress acted in March 2020, when Republicans had more political power and were in the White House, you know, the balance was heavily in favor of loans to corporations and small businesses and helpful tax treatment, special subsidies, essentially, you know, bridge funding for the airline industry, understanding that they were in an especially vulnerable position. I don't know how much Broadway theaters got, but I know airlines got 50 billion. And then when you look at the next tier, direct payments to individuals as well as unemployment insurance benefits were in the neighborhood of 250, 300 billion, you know, not chump change, but not as big as support for businesses. And then of course there were funds that made available for public health, state and local governments and so on. So that's sort of the breakdown. By July, surveys of private economists were saying, well, so that was great. We had, you know, a couple trillion of support in March, but we burned through that pretty quickly. And so the next package should probably be, you know, 1 to 2, maybe 3 trillion. And that was July. And of course, then we waited all the way to December and we got a $900 billion package. By this winter, the same group of economists in this National Association for Business Economics survey were saying, well, you know, I'd say no more than $1.5 trillion, but of course now we have a Democrat in the White House and we have more balance in the Senate, and so the package that came through in December, which was, you know, still sort of the Trump era, still was dominated by small business outlays and transfers to individuals, a little boost for unemployment, and so on. And then the more recent Biden package, I can't remember what it's called, the American something or other rescue plan, you can see was much more tilted towards individuals and state and local governments, and individuals both in the form of direct payments as well as unemployment insurance enhancements. And interestingly, another notable shift in terms of child tax credits, paid leave, and we're now having a conversation about making those things permanent and being more like Europeans that actually care about families than Americans who say they do but kind of fake it. So that's sort of the run through. It's always interesting to me as an economist to reflect on what people think happens with this money. And by the way, you know, a year ago we're doing these PPP loans, which by the way were paycheck protection plan, right? It's the payroll protection plan or something like that. That is, you have to have a payroll. And I hear this story from bankers. They said everybody's just applying for one of these loans, and they're just, you know, they're like real estate investors, and they have vacation rental condos in Waikiki, and I need a payroll protection plan loan. It's like, well, you don't have any payroll. So you know, the problem with giving money away for free like this, particularly when we start giving it to businesses. No offense, but I mean, come on, you're a business. You're supposed to be taking risk. There's a risk. Should have thought about it. Sucks to be you. I mean, I'm sorry, that's my attitude as an economist. So there's, you know, there's going to be a lot of kind of slim shadiness that people are going to find out. And I think as we sort of evaluate ex post how this played out and gear up for the next time. I mean, last time in 2008, you know, when Hank Paulson, when George W's Treasury Secretary, Hank Paulson, proposed the Treasury asset something, whatever TARP was, on Tuesday, September 16th, 2008, people had a cow. They were like, no, brother. The Treasury cannot buy equity in private companies. Oh, hell no, right? And it took a month for that bill to get passed. And I remember because Hank Paulson posted it on the Treasury's website, and it was like a page and a half long. And I remember reading it. I was actually in New York that week watching all this stuff explode. That was the day AIG blew up. I'm having dinner at the, they closed it now, but it was the Four Seasons restaurant, and I'm waiting for my wife and my mother-in-law. And I'm sitting at the bar at the Four Seasons restaurant waiting for them to show up. And these guys down the bar, you know how you're like listening, but you're not listening. So I'm like, I'm not listening. And I hear 85 billion. And I'm like, whoa, that's like, what? And then I remember hearing 85 billion. And then I remember hearing 850 basis points over LIBOR. And you can't remember the way things were back in those days, because we've been living in this fantasy world of low interest rates for 10 years. But the London Interbank Offered Rate on September 16th, 2008 was 5.5%. So 8.5, right? 850 basis points over 500. That's like a 14%. A loan of 85 billion at 14% was what the Treasury was talking about offering, or the Fed, I can't remember, you know, it was the Fed, right? Offering a unit of AIG that was a counterparty to something crazy. Like, I remember hearing, I get, it's been a while, so, but it was something like 60, 70% of all the credit default swaps. This subsidiary of AIG was, okay, blah, 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 blah. That was that world. This is the world we live in now, and we're giving away money for commercial rent. You know, it's like everybody gets money. So we've got to reevaluate this. We can't do this all the time, you guys. And there's a bunch of guys that got money that shouldn't have gotten it. Trust me on that. And now evidently they're buying used cars and single family homes in West Maui. But the weird thing about this is when you give people money, when you give people a tax cut, for example, when you give them, in the case of the CARES Act last year, they don't actually spend the money. I mean, not right away. And this is the breakdown of what happened to the CARES funding that went to individuals and households. A third of it went to straight up like debt, right? They just paying interest on debt. Another quarter went straight to savings. The actual consumption part was quite small, less than half. And so, and this is actually a general proposition, and we can see these. You saw that in the personal savings rate, the first slide I showed you. If you notice, when there's a tax cut, does consumption go up? No, savings goes up. And where there's a tax increase, does consumption go down? No, savings goes down. And as people use savings as the buffer and they smooth out the consumption. So unless it's perceived as a permanent tax change, individuals generally don't use or source the funds, right? Use the funds in the case of a cut, source the funds in the case of a tax increase. They don't generally do that out of consumption. They do that out of savings. And so when you look at how effective CARES Act funding was, and we're going to see the, you know, eventually the analysis. I mean, people are working on the Biden package, right? The American Rescue Plan funding. That's another $2 trillion, right? So I'm sure people are writing those papers. But this is a publication from the Congressional Budget Office itself, 6 months after the CARES Act. And so I presume there'll be another one in September of this year, analyzing, you know, the Biden plan. And we need to learn from this stuff. So for example, you look at the bottom of the list in terms of what was effective, for every dollar of federal budget deficit that we increased as a consequence of the CARES Act, we got 36 cents worth of GDP from the Paycheck Protection Program. Let me say that again. So we borrow $1 from the future that we got to pay back at low interest rate. And so, you know, and there's a crisis, so it's not a bad idea. But for that dollar, we got 36 cents of GDP, whereas for every dollar of direct assistance to state and local governments, we got 88 cents of GDP. That is to say, state and local governments spend the money you give them. That's all they know how to do, right? But if you give money to Slim Shady over here, he's going to go buy a condo or something, and the condo is already there. He's not buying one from Bonnie. He should, which is a new condo. He's buying from Butter over here that, you know, was holding it as a vacation rental and now has no income for the next 6 months. Okay, so we'll go through all that deconstruction over the, you know, we'll do the postmortem later. You can't use monetary policy to do the job of fiscal policy. So we need to understand, you know, we need to learn. It was triage. It was a crazy, scary moment. And in a situation like that, right, you just go big. You don't worry too much about the details. You'll do your recap, you'll do your postmortem and figure out how to do it better next time in 100 years when the next pandemic comes, or next year. When you ask economists what keeps them up at night, recently the big concern has been COVID variants. And back in March, they were still concerned about the Congress being unable to act and so on. There was a little concern about the federal deficit. The most recent survey, the rankings changed a little bit. The variants are still at the top of the list, but not as large a concern. And nobody's talking about the deficit. So here's 2 months ago and last month. So a little more concerned about vaccine distribution. You know, it's not going as fast as we thought. Okay, monetary policy. The financial markets briefly went to the brink, went to the edge of the cliff. While the president was saying, like a miracle, the pandemic will disappear. And that's the moment everybody knew, holy crap, we're in trouble now. And so money market mutual funds again, just like that was Thursday, September 18, 2008, when the money market mutual funds blew up and Hank Paulson and what was his name, Tim Geithner, who was president of the New York Fed, intervened in a half hour on Thursday morning from 11 to 11:30 to you know, so that well, I guess they did technically break the buck. This time it was commercial paper, right? There was a couple moments where the Treasury market stopped functioning briefly in early March 2020. And so the Fed said, oh, hell no. And boom came quantitative easing like we haven't seen it. And we had only just seen it for the first time 10 years earlier. So the Fed's balance sheet dramatically increased. The Fed ramped up its purchases of Treasury securities, mortgage-backed securities. And of course, what do the institutions who are selling those securities, what do they do with the liquidity? They keep it in the bank, so to speak. So you look at reserves of commercial banks increased from 2 trillion to 4 trillion, right? That's their backstop. There's 4 trillion in liquidity literally in the checking accounts that commercial banks hold at the Federal Reserve. That's right, right? Confidence is liquidity. So when there's a loss of confidence, you need more liquidity to give people a backstop. And we're kind of still operating in that environment. And if, you know, over the next several years, it's too soon to have that conversation now, but over the next several years, the Fed will move us towards a conversation about, do we let those securities mature off the balance sheet? And you remember we were having this conversation in 2017 and 18, and you can see that they had begun to unwind the balance sheet pre-COVID. So stay tuned, we're gonna have that conversation again going forward. In terms of interest rate expectations, and again, now the world we live in now, the Fed tells us what they think. So you can look at what the Fed believes about the future path of the overnight interbank lending rate, the Fed funds rate. They believe it will remain relatively low for the next 2 or 3 years. They believe beyond that, it'll eventually go back to a number like 2.5%. So they think of the long-term equilibrium, that's like a reference point, as 2.5%, and it's zero now. It's going to be low for a while. And then well after we've dug ourselves out of the hole created by COVID, we'll normalize. And we were normalizing, you remember, in 2017, 2018. So we've been through this process before. The whole reason for all of this forward guidance from the Fed is that nobody's surprised about it. They tell us everything that's going to happen. And of course, they've got an explicit inflation target. And just a year ago, I mean, August of last year, they said, by the way, our 2% goal, it's now 2% on average. Like, it's not a cap, it's not a floor, it's the average over time. So if we happen to go over 2% for a while, well, we've been under 2% for a while. So you can do the math. How long would it have to, stay? How long could we allow it to stay over 2% to average against the 5 or 10 years that it's been at or below 2%, which is, 5 or 10 years, unless it goes way higher, in which case it's shorter. So they give us all this forward guidance so we know what's coming. And when you look at what long-term interest rates are doing now, that 20, you know the recovery is upon us, even though officially the National Bureau for Economic Research hasn't called the recession as having ended. You know that the recovery is upon us because long-term interest rates are going back up, right? And if the overnight rate in the long run is 2.5%, and if you believe the Fed's commitment to keeping inflation at or around their goal, then there's no reason why long-term interest rates, like the 10-year Treasury note yield or the 30-year bond yield, there's no reason long-term interest rates and short-term interest rates should be materially different. I mean, if you have a small difference, there should be a small, term structure, because maybe there's a liquidity premium, maybe there's a little tiny bit of residual inflation risk. But I just said we all believe the Fed's going to keep inflation from exploding, and so there is no inflation risk. So in a world like that, the Treasury yield curve should be really flat. There should be very little difference between the overnight rate and the long-term rate. And you can already see the bond markets this year, at the end of last year and this year, and they've taken those bond yields right up. And I honestly haven't checked. Have you lately? I'm pretty sure, 1.6, 1.7 is the range for the 10-year note right now. That's kind of an interim step. So that's telling you, the bond market is telling you, this is not an individual who has the power to do whatever she wants. This is millions of traders in the universe taking positions non-collusively, independently of one another based on their own decisions, creating an equilibrium long-term interest rate that is, at or slightly below, because we're on the way to normalization. I mean, we don't actually know what the future is, but we kind of have enough guidance so we can be, it's not 10%, it's not 5%, it's not 3%, it's probably 2%, and we're headed there now. So get a clue, right? Mortgage rates aren't going to stay as low as they have been forever. If the 10-year Treasury notes going to be a 2% or 2.5% kind of long-term equilibrium, then add 175 basis points, and what does that give you? At 2%, that's 3.75. At 2.5%, that's 4.25. That's freaking good money. If you can get a mortgage at 4%, that would still be, as good as it was all during the 2010s, which, by the way, the most affordable decade for housing that I have on record for Hawaii, for Honolulu. So mortgages aren't going to stay at 3%. So don't wait, which is what everybody already knows, which is why they're all buying condos from Bonnie and single-family homes if they can find one. But of course, nobody's listing because they're hoarding their house because they've got to work from home now. The inflation news is related because the market's expectation of inflation is essentially embedded in these interest rates, right? The yield on a 10-year Treasury note has a real component and another piece, which is the inflation expectation. Now, if the Fed tells us that the inflation goal is 2% and we believe them, or more specifically, if the Fed had what they explicitly called a non-target target. I remember Janet Yellen speaking in the executive dining room of Bank of Hawaii about 2007, 2008, when she was president of the San Francisco Federal Reserve. She's Treasury Secretary now. But I remember Janet Yellen saying that her non-target target was 2%. That's the actual expression she used, the non-target target for inflation. And I remember in 2005, the late Ned Gramlich, who was a Fed governor at that time, he totally schooled somebody, and we had a little meeting at the bank, and one of my dearly departed, a real mentor, who has now left us, asked him this like totally lame question. I was like, oh my God, you did not ask that question. And Ned Gramlich's, I just remember his answer, which was something like, surely you know that the Fed has a non-target target and it's 2%. Like, okay, well, if he didn't know it then, he knows it now. That target was formalized in January 2012 by Ben Bernanke, and it's still 2%. The twist being, as of last year, they said 2%, you know, in a range that's like 2% on average, not like 2% the figure. And when you look at the difference between nominal and real U.S. Treasury yields on U.S. Treasury securities, the real yields are TIPS yields, right? Treasury yields on Treasury inflation protected securities. So they don't have the inflation premium, and the regular Treasury market, you know, bond market has the inflation premium. That difference, the difference between nominal and real yields, is the market's implicit inflation expectation. And you can see it punching up above 2%. It's the 5-year expectation has gone up above the 30-year expectation. What does that tell you? It tells you the market's thinking there's going to be more short-term inflation, so as it shows up in the 5-year average, then there will be over the next 30 years. And so there's an inversion there. But I mean, it's not 10%. It's not 5%. It's like 2.2, you know? So, okay, come on, you guys, stop freaking out about inflation. The Fed's goal is set in terms of what's called the personal consumption deflator, which is a slightly different measure from the consumer price index, which is the one we all track, kind of the headline. It's literally called the headline inflation rate because it gets the headline, got the headline today in the advertiser, Star Advertiser. And so 2% on the personal consumption deflator, it turns out translates roughly into 2.5% for the Honolulu CPI, for the US CPI, the Consumer Price Index. And here's the path over the last, 25 years. And, when there's a boom going on, it's higher than that, 4 to 6% in the subprime bubble. So when it gets really bubblicious, it goes up to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6%. And of course, 40 years ago, we were looking at double-digit inflation rates, but those days are over. Ever since Paul Volcker, right? Paul Volcker started the whole process of dialing down the inflation rate, building the credibility of the Federal Reserve for its anti-inflationary policy posture. And then by the time you get to Ned Gramlich, he's saying, surely you know that, the Fed has a non-target target. And then 15 years ago, Janet Yellen saying, she's just straight up saying, well, our non-target target is 2%. Bernanke finally says, yeah, it's 2%. We'll make it official. It's 2%. Ben Bernanke, the guy who wrote the book, the textbook, Inflation Targeting, right? Did you get a clue? So 2% at the Fed's target for the personal consumption deflator means 2.5% for the Honolulu CPI. And we've been running below that for most of the last decade. And now, of course, we get this report that says, well, it's 5% in May. So, okay, wait. Let's just think about this for a second. What was happening a year ago, exactly a year ago in April and May? You know what was hitting the fan? That's what was happening a year ago. Nobody was doing anything there. We were all sitting at home. Well, we were all working at home. And but nobody was going out to eat. Nobody's hardly even going out to shop, right? We'd all stocked up at Costco before the before the lockdown. And so the consumer price index itself, which I'm showing here both for the US and Hawaii, the consumer price index was kind of like soft a year ago. So of course, even if it went back to normal, whatever that is, a year later, it would mean the low number a year ago gives us higher inflation. But yes, there are sources right now of unusually high inflation pressures, and evidently for Honolulu in the last 12 months, they're mostly gasoline, because at $70 a barrel, gasoline is more expensive than it is at $20 a barrel, which it briefly was a year ago. And for some reason, because of used cars. So I guess the moral of that story is, don't buy a used car and you don't have to worry about the inflation. I mean, seriously, that's a headline, but yes, that's what's going on. This is what the consumer price index is doing. I've put in a reference line, that dashed line. That's what the Honolulu Consumer Price Index would be now and in the future and in the recent past. What the Honolulu, I'm sorry, it's now called the Urban Hawaii Consumer Price Index, because it's no longer just the Honolulu Consumer Price Index. You know why? Because Maui is a city. Maui is a metropolitan statistical area. And they thought they were keeping the country. So urban Hawaii is now Oahu and Maui. And anyway, the reference path here is what the CPI for urban Hawaii would have been had inflation actually been 2%, not 2.5% now, had actually been 2% starting in 2016. So yeah, don't have a cow. Here's the inflation rate. Yes, of course that gets a headline. The headline was 5%. Why? Because you pick the largest number, right? Honolulu's inflation rate was 3.8, but the US inflation rate was higher. So we gotta have a story about that. But I'm pretty sure most of this is transitory. And I could be wrong, and this could be the end of the world. And so, yes, you could go out and kill yourself. I think you'd be wrong, but hey, what are you gonna do? The forecasts, numerically, what you get from economists right now, this is from the same surveys I've referenced earlier, for this year and next are kind of like 2.5, 2.2, I mean, it's not right. 2.8, 2.3 is the CPI forecast. 2.2, 2.1 is the core, the PCE deflator forecast without food and energy, for people who don't eat and drive. But even if you look at the 5 highest forecasts, nobody's even talking about 4% inflation. Like the high forecasts are 3 to 4%, and the low forecasts are 1 to 2%. So yeah, this is transitory. At least that's what all the economists are saying. And of course, you should never listen to an economist. Make up your own mind. All right, Patrick. Yeah, let's. So we roll it. You want to throw a couple questions out first?
I will, sure. We've got a bunch of questions. We have some that came in earlier. I'm going to try to consolidate some of them and put them all together. And by the way, just want to remind everyone that is joining us today, we will have Paul's materials as well as a link of the video presentation available. Probably we'll post sometime this weekend, and we'll send you links to all of that. Okay, Paul, you want to come back on the screen? Are you?
I think I am. Yes.
There you are. Okay, here we go. All right. Okay, wow. So let's start with this one, Paul. The last Board of Realtors, Honolulu Board of Realtors statistics that came out show single-family home prices up 29%.
Yeah, I'll talk about that in a second. So let's skip that question.
Okay, gotcha. Okay. Yeah. So maybe we'll look at the more non-real estate related. Okay.
Yeah.
Inflation rate. So we just saw you post Hawaii is maybe 3 point something, national average 4 point something. But it seems anecdotal, and what we read in everything we buy, it seems like those rates are so much higher. Is there a disconnect, or why does it feel that way?
No, it's just, well, first of all, you remember the stuff that went up, right? You don't remember the vast array of things it didn't. Second, the way to do this, so go to target.com and then do the same exercise. It'll make you feel a lot better. Or maybe it'll, you know, convince you that maybe it's not as big a bummer as you think. Yes, there are definitely categories. I mean, I see it in food, especially right now. But I would have to actually go to the CPI, which I did not this morning, to look at, right? There are all these components, right? There's food, food away from home, food at home, and then there's shelter, household furnishings and operations. We could go down the list. And so some things like apparel, part of the headline today was that apparel prices actually went down slightly. I'm wearing all my cheap ass. I don't know where I get this stuff, but it's all cheap. By the way, the price of an aloha shirt today in Honolulu is the same it was in 1990. Who made that up? Well, some child labor in Bangladesh. I don't know what's going on with that. So, all right. It's just, you do have to look at everything. The consumer price index and all price indices are designed to look at as much as possible, both because you want to isolate the specific things that are like the big forcing factors, but also because you do want to have a general feel for the way. But nobody, I don't know, are people complaining that, you know, there's a TJ Maxx down the street from the Ross Dress for Less in Ward Village because their life is so much worse that there's cheap stuff everywhere? Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, the crazy thing about, ooh, our kids have to do school at home. That means we have to buy a new laptop. Oh, boo, $250. You know, it's like, come on. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox there. I mean, it is what it is. The numbers aren't wrong. And there is a thing going on right now, and you should pay attention to it. Because in the past, these things have a tendency to get out of hand. But we're not talking about, it's as if the headline is hyperinflation. And it's like, yeah, it's like 4.99%, which rounds to 5. But it's not 5,000% per day. It's not where by the time you finish the meal at the restaurant, it's more expensive than when you started it. That's what people are actually worried about. This, not so much. But keep an eye on it. You know, it's just like COVID. People were saying about COVID. Don't worry about it. And then next thing you know, you're waiting a year to get a vaccine, or not.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And then one other relates, maybe it's related. The shortage of products, and then apparently there's also a shortage of labor as well for a lot of places trying to reopen. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, well, for Hawaii, I mean, there's a special wrinkle on this. I don't know if you've been paying attention, but people have been leaving Oahu for 5 years in numbers larger than all other sources of population growth combined. So that can't be good. But that's a special factor, right? That's Hawaii. I mean, that's Oahu. But actually now it's also Hawaii, statewide. And, oh, I forgot, Kauai. Wait a minute. That's starting to be a pattern. There are a lot of people that were employed in travel and tourism, for example, particularly on the neighbor islands, that just bailed, right? They went home, i.e. to their parents' house on the mainland when the hotel shut down. So a lot of what we're seeing are problems like that. A whole nother part of it is also typical of a recession recovery cycle, although this one, of course, was huge and then got compressed into a really narrow time frame, which is that you have these structural dislocations. So a lot of what you're seeing right now is just mismatch. And then some of it, I hate to say it, bless their hearts, Wendy's is opening a burger place that I can ride my bike to in Kailua over here. And they got a big sign out front with $12 per hour. And I'm kind of like, those poor bastards. I've done the math, you know, when I worked for Dole Cannery in the summer of 1973 at $1.67.5 an hour, which was a 2.5 cent premium. over the minimum wage because I drove a forklift. It turns out that that wage was either at or a little bit higher. It's like, I think I figured out one day that it was the equivalent of $12 to $15. So we're still just a little shy of that. Anyway, all those things are going to play themselves out. The shortage of products in particular categories is a function of supply chain disruptions that are uniquely associated with the pandemic event itself. So like the thing with pickup trucks, it's the chips in the trucks. It's literally the processors that are in short supply, and you can't just like dial up the robots, right? Because these plants are set up. This is what I learned about toilet paper. There's no excess capacity in the toilet paper production industry, right? Every day, the same amount of toilet paper gets used worldwide. It's not like there's a business cycle in toilet paper. And so you design the factory to just hit that number. You know, guy needs another roll of toilet paper, it rolls off the assembly plant. And chips were kind of that way too by the time we got to 2019. And then comes a moment where everybody drives down to Costco, loads up the back of their pickup truck, just like they do before every hurricane, with gigantic quantities of toilet paper, except that the whole planet did that last March. And the industry's out of whack for a year, well, months anyway. So a lot of it is just that whole, the nature of the shock. It's not, by the way, people getting paid too much for being unemployed. Trust me, it's not that. At least the literature is at best ambivalent about that argument. And we actually knew that from a year ago. There was definitive evidence that that's not what was going on, because people were talking about this last summer, and now they're talking about it again. And I guess half the states in the country are going to screw those guys. So good luck with that.
Okay. All right. And then Paul, did you want to talk a bit on the real estate before?
Yeah,
we get into the real estate
I
questions?
do want to
Okay.
head back into the slides for a few minutes just to.
Okay.
This is the lightning round, but I'm going to focus on one specific link between remote work and what's happening in the housing market. So let me just give you a feel for how I talked about structural change in the labor force, in the labor market, and in the workplace. Before COVID, but before March of last year, let's say, 90% of US workers had never worked from home, and only 3.4% worked from home full time. Okay, so 90% of Americans had never worked from home, and only 3 or 4% worked from home part-time. Now, very quickly, within 2 months, the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta conducted this survey in May of last year and found that up to 25% of workers after COVID would be working in at least hybrid arrangements where they're at home part of the time. That is, work from home was so successful that everybody very rapidly began to rethink about why they were going to a workplace. A survey from this January that the National Association again conducts found that huge proportions, a third of all employees, a third of all companies responding in these surveys said that everybody worked from home. At one point last year, half of US GDP was being produced at home. So we discovered that it actually worked. When you survey firms about whether, their people are faking it, 60% of respondents say that work from home worked out better, substantially better, or hugely better than they thought it would ex ante. So there are other things that happen from COVID. I'll show you a couple. This is investment in information technology. This is the growth of US investment in information technology, equipment, and software. So a gigantic explosion. Yes, everybody had to go buy a laptop for the kids, but now the kids have a laptop and they know how to do, actually the kids already knew how to do Zoom. Now all the parents know how to do Zoom. And so we don't have to go to a Bitcoin conference in Florida and have it turn into a COVID super spreader event. That just happened this week. You think people would learn? So, I mean, that's kind of amazing. That everybody spent a year getting better technology, and now they're more productive. Here's another. This is an extraordinary data set. This is the number of applications for a federal employer ID number. Exploded after COVID-19, right? You can see the path pre-COVID used to be 200,000 per month, and then gradually over the business cycle, it rose during the 2010s expansion to 300,000 a month. And then it exploded to 500,000 applications per month. So again, I worked at home, I got some technology, I realized I can start a business online. So there are a bunch of huge changes going on, and the work from home, the the Bureau of Labor Statistics had never, measured this with any regularity or in any detail. This is the proportion of workers 25 and over who, in addition to those who used to work from home pre-COVID, right? So this is the additional guys, the additional proportions of the workforce that work from home because of COVID-19 by educational attainment. And so you can see clearly it's the more highly educated, more highly skilled, more productive, and higher compensated workers. 30% of college graduates, 40% of persons with an advanced degree were still working at home as of this spring. And it looks to me like the average is going to settle around 20%, maybe 15 to 20%. Well, there were already, what did we say, 5 or 10% before? It's a huge increase in the proportion of the workforce that will work at home at least part of the time relative to the pre-COVID benchmark. And so as for this and other reasons, actually, this has nothing to do with work from home, but I want to do a setup on bubbles. This is GameStop stock, right? So there's a bubble. When people say a bubble, there you go. There's the bubble in January, which then exploded and then got revived on Reddit or something. And then you can see the oscillatory, right? The boing. So that's a bubble, a high frequency bubble. These are daily closing prices. There was a recession, then there was a recovery. GameStop is like a lot of other brick and mortar retail, right? You spent a year at home, your UPS guy is on your street every day. I can look at my UPS guy is here more than my postal lady delivering stuff, because we all were using e-commerce before COVID, but now we're totally committed to e-commerce. And so a place like GameStop, which you can download the software, right? You don't have to go to the store to buy Pikachu. And so their recovery, like a lot of retail recoveries, is cast in some doubt, and there people are speculating against it. Well, I just want to, there's a bubble. So here's another bubble. Home prices in Las Vegas. Is this Las Vegas? I can't see it's either Las Vegas or Phoenix. So there's the subprime bubble. That's how the bubble works. Here's a bubble at high frequency daily trading prices, closing prices in a stock earlier this year. This is over the last 20 years, how the thing worked out in, I think it's Las Vegas. And now people are talking about a bubble here in Hawaii because they're looking at single family home prices that are, hitting $1 million or $1 million, as Dr. Evil says. And so we need to put that in perspective. It's a fact, Jack, that single family home prices are punching out. These are Oahu single family home prices. They are clearly punching out of the range that was established in the late 2010s. That is, and this was the regression from 2012 to 2018. 2012, the date I guessed in 2005 that things would get back to normal. In answer to a question from a realtor on Kauai, who was upset that I was saying that, that cycle was over. That path, that 4% or 5% in the case of condos, that path of 4 or 5% appreciation, you can see was one against which in 2018 and 2019, when the local economy began to stagnate, prices drifted under. And then, of course, comes COVID, And this is a big surprise to people, that all of a sudden everybody wants a single family home and nobody wants to sell theirs. Well, there's the problem. You're not listing yours because you're hiding out in it. And if you want to buy one, it's not like somebody can actually build one. Bonnie can build condos because they've spent 5, 10, 15 years and got a 12-year master plan, right? You know, they've had their projects in motion at Ward Village for a decade or more, which is the only reason they can actually build the next building. And they still have to go get permission for every goddamn building. Oops, excuse me, I shouldn't say that. But okay, so there's something going on, and I say it has to do with this partly. It's just on the margins, this one thing, vagabond workers are a delta. They didn't exist in large numbers before, and all of a sudden they're going to be a bigger part of the workforce than we thought would ever be true. And it's perfectly permissible. It turns out they're more productive. It turns out the most productive people are the ones that thrive in that environment the most, and therefore they can live in Kaka'ako. They can live in a condo in Ward Village, or a house up in Pupukea, or over on the north shore of Kauai, if they can actually get their car there after the flood, right? They can live anywhere they want. And so they're starting to do that. And what we saw briefly last year was this breakdown where condo inventories were piling up because people were dumping them. They were dumping the vacation rentals in particular, whereas single family home inventories were getting drawn down. These are months of inventory remaining. These are the new listings. And these are all listings. Single family home inventories were just shriveling because nobody was listing them and everybody wanted them and nobody can build them. So that's all this says. Or actually, this says, let's do some math. So let's do the math, lightning round. Here's the trend for single family home prices. Here's the trend for condo prices on Oahu. I'm going to extract the trend. And what do I get? I get this detrended cycle and some noise for single family and condo prices. And then when I pull the cycles out, right? So I pull the cycle out of the detrended prices, I get this thing happening. And what's happening at the right end of the screen is single family homes. Zounds, they're exploding. What about condos? Not so much. Single family homes exploding. Condos, meh. So it's there, you know, there's something. It's not low interest rates, because low interest rates affects everybody, not just single family homes. And when you look at the neighborhood data, you can see what's happening, right? It's the suburbs, it's the exurbs, it's Zoom towns across rural America that are benefiting from this sudden shift in the nature of work, where it takes place, and where the most productive workers are interested in having their habitation. Or maybe it's just they want to be on Maui for 4 months out of the year. That's going on. So the neighborhoods with big increases were all North Shore, Windward, East Honolulu, whereas the urban core was being beat down. Essentially the same pattern in single family homes. And on Maui, in Maui County, you know, where are the boom towns? They're Zoom towns. Molokai, West Maui. Yeah. And the condos are a little less representative because you got this wacky Lanai number. But again, West Maui and Molokai show up. So on Kauai, you see again, single family home prices exploding, not so much condos, post-COVID, exploding from the lower to the upper bandwidth of the 20 teens range. You see it on the Big Island, maybe not as robustly, but especially in West Hawaii Island, right on the Kona side, as opposed to the Hilo side. And when you line those movements up with some California benchmarks, San Francisco Bay Area, and what do I have? LA, you know, Metro. Again, it's happening a lot of places, and these are the same prices, but here I've normalized. So in terms of standard deviations, you're looking at, you know, 1 or 2 standard deviations of bust a move in the post-COVID period. Now, is that a bubble? My answer is, yeah, no, I think that's actually transitory too. I think it's like the used Toyota Tacoma prices. They're not making any more of them. They can't because they can't get a chip. Actually, they made them, but they can't finish them because they can't get chips. And people want pickup trucks. Why? I don't know. Because of global warming. I don't know. So I mean, I want one. I got a Toyota 4Runner. I took my first trip in a year and a half and rented a Toyota 4Runner from Avis in Denver. Right? I signed up and prepaid for a Toyota Corolla. And all they had was a 4Runner. So I had this big ass truck and it was like awesome, 4x4 going in the mountains. I'm just saying demand went up, supply can't respond. What did you think was going to happen? But demand only went up for single family homes, not so much for condos. So what does Howard Hughes do at Ward Village? They make a condo that people's going to want. There you go. That's how you react. There is a debate between the sort of the Stanford view that Nicholas Bloom advocates that work from home is here to stay. And then you've got Ed Glazer saying, well, wait a minute. If people leave Midtown Manhattan, if the old fucks leave Midtown Manhattan for somewhere out in Pennsylvania, and because they can still phone it in, that means rents are going to fall in Midtown Manhattan. And a bunch of millennials can move into Kaka'ako, where the action is, right? They're happy the old dudes are moving out of the urban core because it means that housing is going to be more affordable. So this ain't over yet, and we're going to see what I think is a one-time shift in the proportion of the workforce working remotely generate a transitory impulse, a transitory increase in demand, complicated by the fact that supply cannot respond. You cannot build a single-family home on Oahu. It can't be done. It took 20 years for Castle and Cook to even get permission to do it. So yes, you can do it. It only takes you 20 years. So this is not going to help this time. But as I say, I think once everybody sorts themselves out, then we're done and we go back to the old, kind of tranquil path of 4% depreciation in nominal terms, 2% after inflation. We've got some other heavy lifting to do. I'm not going to read all of these bullet points, some of which replicate points I made earlier. But I would say this is not a bubble. This is sort of just a freaky year, and we've got other issues to deal with, like getting tourism back to normal. And it's going to be another year before the foreign tourists even start to show up, in material numbers. So our work is cut out. And as I say, you can, I can't remember where the end of this slideshow is. Yeah, this was actually supposed to be one slide earlier. But, stay tuned. There are dislocations out there, no doubt. I don't think they're permanent in character. And I think we'll be back on track. Although maybe, it's like the old surfing expression, dude, you should have been here yesterday. I think we may be in one of those moments this summer.
So Paul, just so that I can bring it up next year when we do this.
Yeah.
When is the single family home market going to correct, and when should we all buy a house?
Well, I mean, okay, so why would it correct?
Or will it correct?
Huh?
Will it correct, or is it just going to?
I don't know. I'm thinking, are prices moving so much? First of all, the listing thing is real in single family homes. Even if things are starting to get back to normal now, there was a moment for at least 6 months of last year where listings went down way more in the single family space than they did in the condos. Whereas condos were going through this fire sale, right? Where dump your vacation rental. We're going back to normal already right now, but you can't overcome that kind of, it's a supply chain breakdown. Just like with computer chips and toilet paper, the supply chain broke down. Single family homes weren't being listed at a moment when demand for those types of dwellings went up in an environment in which supply cannot respond, right? Those guys over at Ho'opili, those guys up at Coral Ridge, they're building as fast as they can. They're building as fast as their entitlement allow. And these guys at Ho'opili, last time I talked to them, I asked them, how come you guys aren't building by the train station? Oh, the city and state, they still don't have a plan for how to build at a train station, like, because 15 years wasn't long enough. So those dislocations on the supply side, on production, and then whatever was leading people to hoard their home and not list, are still a legacy. You asked when will it resolve, and I'm thinking it is in the process of resolving. Do I think there's going to be an unwinding and unraveling? No, I don't. I mean, you can just sit in your house and do your work. So I don't think there's a whole back end. There are three sources of vulnerability. One, interest rates are going to be higher eventually. That's always a headwind. Second, buyer's remorse. I heard this story yesterday from a guy on Maui. My neighbor listed their house. Then my neighbor bought the house from me for $750 3 years ago. They appraised at $950. I mean, the buyer wants to buy it now, 2-3 years later. The appraisal is $950, and they're willing to pay $1.2 million or something like that, 1.3, because they have cash, because they're, .com refugees or something. And I'm thinking, so these guys are wealthy enough to burn an extra $200,000 to $300,000 cash to make sure they get the house they want in upcountry Maui. Yeah, I don't lose any sleep about people with that kind of money and those kinds of jobs. And I don't think they're going to discover that Maui sucks and they're going to have to bail out. They just realized the dream of their life because their HR department finally let them do what they knew they could have been doing all along, which is not have to come to downtown San Francisco to sit in an office all day. So keep your eyes on this. This is, a lot of this is new. We haven't seen a lot of it. We thought for 25 years about, internet is going to liberate us to work from home. And then all of a sudden it happened in like 5 minutes and we're still having to deal with it.
Yeah. Well, Paul, thank you so much for your time today. It's always amazing. I wish we had another hour together. It goes so quick.
Right?
I know, right? And before we sign off, I want to thank Crystal and her team at the Hawaii Association of Realtors for everything that they did, especially being in the control room, taking care of everything. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everybody's questions, but hopefully we'll do one of these again. Thank you also to the sponsors, and everybody stay safe out there, and hopefully we'll see you soon. And Paul, take care.
Aloha, everybody.
Aloha.